A state-owned bank, a state-owned mill, a state-owned elevator. How did these seemingly socialist organizations come to be in the heart of the United States? The quiet prairies of North Dakota seemed an unlikely place for an economic and social revolution. But in 1914, after decades of exploitation by out-of-state business, the spark was struck, which ignited the political prairie fire known as the Nonpartisan League.
Production funding for the rise and fall of the Nonpartisan League is provided in part by the North Dakota Humanities Council, a nonprofit independent state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.
Farming is a very insecure business. So that insecurity was something that farmers were hoping to politically fix somehow. They were distant from banks and from cities and from what seemed to be the centers of financial and economic power, so they seemed to be essentially at the mercy of other people making big decisions about their lives.
The Nonpartisan League and A.C. Townley were able to tap into that. They were able to point at the banks which were charging usurious interest rates, companies that were setting the prices that they were paying for grains, and say, hold it, you've got to take control of this situation. By 1918, they had taken control of North Dakota government completely.
Following the election of 1918, the League now held all but one state office, a majority of seats in both the House and Senate, and 4 out of 5 Supreme Court seats. More importantly, the League had the amended Constitution it needed to implement the industrial program. It should have been clear sailing.
The League's effort in 1917 and in 1918 to engage in various business enterprises becomes very problematic and does damage to the organization's chances in the upcoming elections. There are a number of kind of schemes that the League doesn't necessarily back but is affiliated with or associated with that leave some members dissatisfied and provide grist for opponents. The first of these enterprises is the United Consumer Stores. They were different than cooperatives in that you did not buy a membership share. You simply put money forward and had the right to shop there at prices that were greatly reduced from what you might encounter at another merchant in the small town where you did your shopping. But this form of organizing a store cut against the cooperative grain, and they knew that a cooperative was about buying a share. United Consumer Stores was nothing about that. The primary shares of the company were held by League leaders, and League organizers who were out enrolling members were also selling United Consumer Stores memberships. In other words, it was not clear where exactly the line was between the Nonpartisan League and the United Consumer Store. It was a mess, and it became a disaster for the Nonpartisan League, in that opponents of the League could say, look, this is a Nonpartisan League scheme to take your money. And it's all going to the hierarchy of the League organization, to Townley and his lieutenants, and they're not accountable for the money. And to some extent, that was true. The significance of the degradation from within in the Nonpartisan League in 1917 and 1918, largely around the kind of failed business ventures. Because I think that that was really important in kind of creating disaffected members who were like, wait a second, now they're coming back and they want my money for this, or there's this crazy scheme at the Scandinavian American Bank in Fargo, or what's this fish company that this guy is starting? I think that's a really important part of the story.
It wasn't only the League's questionable business ventures that were eroding support for Townley. Some League leaders had always chafed under his iron control, but it wasn't until the 1918 defeat of the League's superintendent of schools that one prominent member publicly broke ranks.
Minnie J. Nielsen, who is elected to be the state superintendent of schools in 1918. did not have much of an educational background, at least not that what we would expect.
Nielsen had earned her teaching certificate in 1902, when teachers were hard to come by and requirements were not very rigorous.
She had a lower grade certificate. She'd gone to a lot of colleges, but it was like for a 2-week session, a 3-week session.
A law had been passed in 1911 raising the requirements, but the law had not been made retroactive. Although Nielsen held what was now considered a low-level certificate, it was enough to qualify her as a candidate. The League used her low-level credentials as an excuse to overturn her election.
I think she had a lot of nerve. She stands up to the NPL. She stands up for a woman's right to hold a political office. And in opposition to her is Neil MacDonald, who is the superintendent of schools during the first years of the NPL. And he's got great ideas for school districts to consolidate, to improve education, to provide better textbooks for the kids. But he is either a misogynist and can't accept Minnie J. Nielsen, will follow him, or he's just a bully. I don't know, because he physically refuses to leave his office. And of course, Minnie J. Nielsen, you're picking on this poor spinster. That turns people.
One of the people it turned was Attorney General William Langer.
Minnie Nielsen is kind of like a tip of an iceberg of a growing confrontation between Langer and the MPL. With Minnie Nielsen, there was a real problem. She was qualified to do this job. Just because you're qualified doesn't mean the good old boys in the party are going to endorse you. That was the problem. You had some good old boys in the MPL who had their guy. So Attorney General Langer was asked, because he's one of the good old boys in the MPL, so they thought. He issued a ruling based upon his profession as a lawyer that she was qualified. And that got him in a lot of trouble, simply because he ruled in her favor. And although he made the ruling based upon his understanding of the law, it was interpreted politically.
In the wake of World War I, another group of opponents to the Nonpartisan League, and this is especially true in North Dakota, emerges from farmers who had joined the League but became dissatisfied with it. In no small part because they didn't see it as democratic enough. The organization that proclaimed power to the people, that engaged in a rhetoric of popular politics, and to some extent was already empowering the average person to become more involved, suffered from a lack of democracy internally, because by that point Arthur Townley essentially controlled the organization and made sure it was kept in a kind of strict hierarchy with him at the top. So these dissatisfied Leaguers complained through 1917, 1918, and by the end of 1918, they're kind of done. They're ready to move on. And so what you see here is essentially an organization giving birth to its own opposition.
As dissatisfaction with the League grew, Old Guard Republicans stepped up attacks on Townley's credibility. Chief among them was longtime League opponent Jerry Bacon.
He is the editor of the Grand Forks Herald. He and many other traditional newspaper editors are very much anti-League for a variety of reasons, but Townley becomes his favorite whipping boy. He can write the most savage editorials. He can write editorials that make you wince just reading them 100 years later. He puts out little freebie newspapers, little freebie magazines. Some of the material he puts out is just scathing. And he somehow links all of these people together, Townley as well as Gruna, Robert La Follette, a whole scads of those folks, as socialists, Bolsheviks, industrial workers of the world. They're all one big lump of evil as far as he's concerned.
Bacon was not alone in his hatred of the League and its president. He found a powerful ally in his fight to oppose the man he called Czar Townley.
Theodore Nelson had been deeply involved in the cooperative movements in North Dakota in the early 20th century. He'd even worked for the Society of Equity. And Nelson at first gets on board with the Nonpartisan League. He sees a lot of his colleagues from the Society of Equity and the Equity Cooperative Exchange alongside him in the movement. But unlike them, he becomes dissatisfied rather quickly with this lack of democracy in the Nonpartisan League itself. And so Nelson becomes one of the prime leaders of a nascent organization that eventually takes the name the Independent Voters Association. And what Nelson does is he draws on all the techniques of organizing that he had learned and draws on the sentiment that he is already quite familiar with amongst farmers from the cooperative movement. And he essentially copies the Nonpartisan League model. That is, he creates a nonpartisan, non-party aligned organization that is meant to endorse candidates around a specific platform and would put up those candidates for a variety of offices at local and state levels. So essentially, he takes the Nonpartisan League model and creates the most effective form of opposition to the League. In 1919, there's a dust-up between Arthur Townley and members of the Farmers Union in North Dakota and the creation of the consumer stores. And that started to lead to more and more fissures in the League itself and started to allow the IVA to pick up essentially those who were disaffected and dissatisfied with League leadership. Theodore Nelson was very careful to ensure that the IVA's pitch was basically for the same things that the League is for, but we're not going to have this autocratic dictator in charge of us, that you, the membership, will always be in charge. And once again, that's largely because you had a movement for democracy that until 1920 or 1921 wasn't especially democratic.
The IVA not only appealed to disaffected Leaguers, but also to longtime Republicans who never supported the League's political agenda.
The IVA is a collection of individuals who at the time are often referred to as real Republicans. The NPL had, of course, pretty much taken over the Republican Party, and you wanted to be clear that you were a real Republican, not one of those NPL Republicans. And so Jerry Bacon helps get some of those folks who had felt locked out of their own party. But he also manages to stir up some individuals who had one time been NPL supporters, and the biggest one, best known one, is probably William Langer.
It starts with the Minnie Nielsen and Neil McDonald business. Langer sees Arthur Townley, Lynn Fraser, and others pull out the bag of political dirty tricks to try to take this power away from her, I think is what it really originally sours him on the League. It's really all downhill from there.
In the 1919 legislative session, friction between Townley and Langer began to erode the League's relations with other elected officials. Secretary of State Tom Hall was the only Republican incumbent to seek the League's endorsement in 1917, but only because it was clear which way the wind was blowing. State Treasurer Carl Kosicki was somewhat supportive of League principles, but had misgivings about Townley.
Langer and Hall and Kosicki are old progressive Republicans. Okay, they weren't original NPLers, so to speak. They are brought in from the progressive Republican side in 1917. They're part of the administration. And they will band together over the issue of the Scandinavian American Bank.
The Scandinavian American Bank in Fargo had been purchased by the League to serve as depository for the League's membership revenue and to finance some of the League's business ventures. Unfortunately, the League bought the bank using a dubious scheme in which the League borrowed money from the bank, which it used to buy the bank from itself.
The Scandinavian American Bank, in modern parlance, was almost equivalent to a Ponzi scheme. Langer and Hall and Kosicki, people who are objecting, they will be singled out by the League as do-gooders per se, looking where they shouldn't look. And the net result's going to be that the three of them are going to be generally lumped together as traitors to the Nonpartisan League.
At the same time, that legislative session creates a whole host of dissent. And those three officials are often seen as the first to break with the Nonpartisan League. In fact, that was, I would argue, the kind of end game, that there had actually been this bubbling up of dissent from within the organization, and that in order to understand the attempts by these politicians to leave the League and then viciously critique it, essentially what they're doing is following through on things that had already been raised. questions raised by some of the League's own employees and organizers. There's a petition in 1918 from within the League's leadership, a petition to Arthur Townley saying, we need to actually create more democratic structures within the League itself. And if you don't do that, there's going to be problems. Townley characterized this, along with his closest advisors, as a revolt, and he essentially, in his own words, put it down. He was less able to do that with elected officials. But the stage had been set.
It was the start of open hostilities between the three elected officials and the League.
Initially, the governor's office, the state legislature, what they'll do is they'll defund the attorney general's office.
Langer and Hall initiated a state banking board investigation into the purchase of the Scandinavian American Bank. The governor responded by vetoing the banking board's appropriation. Kosicki announced an investigation into what he claimed were padded expense reports of League officials. The legislature cut his budget by 75%. Kosicki shot back by refusing to issue expense checks to legislators. The situation became so heated that a fistfight broke out in the Capitol hallway between Kosicki and Senator A. Leiterbach, resulting in Kosicki locking himself in his office and refusing to respond to a court summons to appear before a Senate hearing. The three so-called turncoats cut their last ties to the League.
They all decide that they are going to remain in office, but they are going to essentially be real Republicans. They're not even the loyal opposition. They're the disloyal opposition. They're the enemy within your gates.
Townley's response, in public at least, was to, of course, claim that they had defected, that it was of a level of betrayal and treason that should not confuse any good, long-standing member of the Nonpartisan League, that in fact they should be understood as traitors, as people who had left the movement and were now vicious enemies of the movement and therefore had to be resisted at every turn. And certainly not believed. Certainly not believed.
Despite the growing political infighting, the League was able to capitalize on the mandate it received from voters.
With the altered Constitution and new judges on the Supreme Court to interpret that Constitution, the NPL in 1919 pretty much has a free rein, and they can pretty much accomplish a great deal of what they want.
There were 3 bills that the legislature in 1919 passed. The one created an industrial commission, which included the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of agriculture and labor at that time, which is what he was known. Those 3 elected officers were going to run the industries.
I think that the reason for that is they wanted 3 individually, independently elected officials who are overseeing it as a group. That's why it's not under the control of any one person, but in fact under the control of 3 people who are individually elected by the people of the state. And of course the controversy swirled.
At that time, all 3 of those officers, of course, were nonpartisan Leaguers. There was a big fight about that. The minority in the legislature wanted to make that a 9-person commission, which would include opponents of the Industrial Commission as well. But the Nonpartisan League controlled both the Senate and the House, and there was no way they were going to allow minority representation on this Industrial Commission, so they kept it small. The second bill created the industries itself, created the Bank of North Dakota, and allocated funds, startup funds we would call it today, to the bank. Legislation also allowed for the creation of the state-owned mill and elevator. And then the third bill allowed the state to sell bonds to the tune of $12 million to fund the industries. And those 3 bills were introduced in January and were signed into law in February. They had less than 2 months. They had passed those 3 bills. They also included an emergency clause, which said that the bank had to be up and running within 90 days. So they put a lot of pressure immediately to sell those bonds so that there would be funds to lend to farmers.
There was a lot of consternation from the people in Minnesota in particular. There were interests in the mill and in the banks who saw nothing but an opportunity for them to lose an economic advantage that they had when they had the farmers of North Dakota over the barrel, and we were forced here to sell our wheat under the terms and conditions that were offered to them by these out-of-state operations.
The program itself is passed in the legislature, signed by the governor into law, but it's already on its way to the Supreme Court.
Scott versus Fraser, or the 42 taxpayers suit, challenging the industrial program and challenging the right of North Dakota to create a state-owned bank, challenging the state of North Dakota, saying it really can't create a state-owned mill and elevator. That suit was brought by the railroads.
They found a number of North Dakota residents who filed litigation claiming that it was a violation of first the U.S. Constitution, the Commerce Clause, and a number of other cases. It wound its way eventually up to the Supreme Court, and they upheld the history of why it is that the voters of North Dakota decided at long last they were going to take matters into their own hands and establish a state-owned mill and elevator for the purpose of ending the tyranny that we felt we were experiencing as a result of the activities in Minnesota. They upheld the legality and the constitutionality of the Industrial Commission, the mill and elevator, and the Bank of North Dakota.
The 42 taxpayers lawsuit was not the only attack being mounted against the League.
The opposition to the Nonpartisan League was relentless because among the corporate folks who opposed the idea of a progressive farmer-owned organizations, they are well-financed and it's much easier for them. There are fewer moving parts to stay organized.
Despite Townley's efforts to control the League, it had begun to fall apart.
Over the previous 2 years, Arthur Townley found himself in the situation where he was dealing with this gradual emergence of real resistance from within the organization. And some chose to defect. Arthur LeSueur, who had known Townley since their days together in the Socialist Party in the state of North Dakota, and had been one of the primary thinkers in the Nonpartisan League, breaks with the Nonpartisan League.
And leading the charge in North Dakota was William Langer.
Langer is going to go head-to-head with Arthur Townley. Townley is going to respond in kind, painting Langer as a traitor to the cause. And it boils down to essentially some name-calling, and he said, and you said, which culminates in the League getting the liar's law passed, making it illegal to spread falsehoods or say anything that's supposed to be a lie. It's obviously an unconstitutional law to begin with, but it passes here. But Langer will immediately challenge Townley to open debates. He'll end up, in rebuttal, writing his own book about the Nonpartisan League, and in it, he really vilifies Townley and what he sees as these outside influences that he's brought in for the League.
Townley was not one to back down from a fight. At the end of the 1919 session, a bill was introduced to have Langer, Secretary of State Thomas Hall, and State Auditor Carl Kosicki impeached because they defected to the IVA.
It's a manifestation of a deeper crisis that's happening within the League, and largely because they hold elected office, these three officials. Langer had definitely been a leaguer, but Hall and Kosicki had not been particularly swept up in the League excitement. They had been endorsed by the League in previous elections. They had agreed to support the League's platform, but ultimately they also had the freedom to withdraw themselves from that, and that's exactly what happened in 1919.
Although the impeachment bill failed to pass, the gloves were off, and the IVA came out swinging.
Langer's going to attack Townley as the leader of this cabal that's currently running, that he sees running the NPL.
This is an excerpt from Langer letter to Townley, okay? Quote, "You and your hirelings have lied to and are deceiving the farmers of North Dakota. You who had the greatest opportunity ever given to any man in North Dakota were not big enough for the job. Greedy for power, hungry for money, self-indulgent in your whims, and with a mighty hate for all honest men who dare to counsel moderation, you betray the farmers of North Dakota." End quote. In other words, he said, no, he didn't betray the MPL. They betrayed the farmers.
And he's going to take the very platform of the NPL and label it as the result of socialist thinking, socialist agitators. Langer's going to paint Townley and his assistants and associates as outsiders who are coming into North Dakota to turn it into a Bolshevik enclave.
The IVA said they wanted to reclaim essentially North Dakota for North Dakotans. But they specifically say that Townley has brought radicals by the score. He's brought Reds, he's brought the derelicts of society, and basically we need to clean up North Dakota, for want of a better term. We need to ensure that the good people are here.
The IVA capitalized on the long-standing resentment die-hard Republicans had always felt against the League.
The fact that the real Republicans didn't really have control of their own party. And if you're a real Republican, you're either going to have to join the League, become a Democrat, or move. Because if you're a real Republican, there's no place for you in state government.
Dissatisfied Leaguers and resentful Republicans swelled the ranks of the IVA, turning it into the out-of-state opposition's most effective weapon against the League's most important success, the industrial program. Despite IVA's opposition and the 42 taxpayer lawsuit, the League's state-owned industries were about to become reality. But first, the League had to sell $10 million in bonds to get them off the ground.
It's fascinating when you think about it. Here's the state of North Dakota who's going to create a state-owned bank which runs directly in the face of private capital, private banking as we knew it in the state before. So they create this socialist institution. They hire a banker, a well-respected banker, to run the bank. He then goes to the banks in the state and says, I have $10 million worth of bonds to sell you. And as soon as you buy these bonds, I can then make loans to farmers, charging 2% less interest than you're charging. So come and buy these bonds from me. The state bankers are saying, you got to be kidding me. The Minneapolis bankers are saying, you want us to buy the bonds so you can cut our lending to North Dakota farmers? I don't think so.
These are public bonds being floated in an atmosphere in which the scuttlebutt is that this is a socialist bank, and who would want to invest in a socialist bank?
When it seemed that hope was lost, North Dakota's bonds found an unlikely champion in wealthy New York City financier Bernard Baruch.
He bought bonds of the Bank of North Dakota as an investor. He was a very shrewd investor, and he was from a family that really respected philanthropy. While he was in the Wilson War Cabinet, Baruch discovered that the farmers were being screwed. So he invested in it. His friends would say, oh, you can't buy those socialist bonds. He said, they're just farmers. He said, it's a good investment.
But the rest of Wall Street continued to boycott the bonds. By 1921, more than half were still unsold. Abandoning the attempt to attract big biz, Governor Fraser launched an appeal to farm and labor unions across the country. They responded by pledging $6 million to buy the outstanding bonds. Enough to launch the industrial program.
Political controversy that was stirred up by creating institutions. Once those institutions, the mill and the bank, were created, that really mobilized the opposition.
1 month later, the IVA filed a lawsuit claiming the sale was fake and obtained an injunction blocking the final sale.
You know how politics works. The minute a program starts to show problems, then all of a sudden the enemies of the program and enemies of the people that created the program appear like grasshoppers in August.
The state Supreme Court quickly vacated the injunction and allowed the bond sale to go through. Blocked on this issue, the IVA charged the League with mishandling the fledgling institutions.
There was a whole initiative that the IVA put on the ballot to the citizens of North Dakota saying, we've got to get this bank audited, we've got to get the crooks out of there. So the people of North Dakota said, within a year of the bank starting, okay, let's have an audit. They agreed, they voted for the audit. The IVA hired a firm out of Minneapolis for $12,000, which is a huge sum of money, to audit the Bank of North Dakota in its first year of operation. The company said, we can't really find anything wrong with it. We can't find anything good with it, but there doesn't seem to be any problems associated with it. We don't like the legislation that created it. We don't like the fact that it's run by an industrial commission, but can't find anything wrong with it. The House didn't like that idea, and so the House said, well, we're going to have our own audit, the House of Representatives, which at this time now the NPL had lost control of and the IVA had control of. Well, the Senate, which was still run by the Nonpartisan League, said, well, if the House is going to have an audit, we're going to have an audit too. They're both running these simultaneous audits. The Fargo Forum is lambasting the Bank of North Dakota every chance it gets. So all of the negative publicity that's coming out, but it didn't matter what the reality was because the perception was the bank is insolvent.
The IVA also stirred up unrest about how long the mill was taking to get off the ground.
It was a little different for establishing a mill than establishing a bank, because the Bank of North Dakota operated here in the Capitol building in the balcony of the House of Representatives, and that was their office, so you didn't have to construct anything. And then, of course, all state tax revenue went into the bank, and so they had a ready place for assets to go. Constructing a mill is a little bit different. You have to actually sell the bond, you have to make sure you have the place to put it, and then you have to go through the actual construction of the facility itself. So there's a lead time that's necessary for any operation of that sort, and so that's what happened, and it took a little while to get it up and running.
With the League under pressure to get a state mill off the ground, they decided to buy a struggling mill in Drake, North Dakota.
It had to be in tremendous error. If you look at North Dakota's wheat belt, it's outside the wheat belt, but it meant that wheat actually had to be shipped the wrong way. And after being shipped the wrong way, how do you make money? And there's always been the comment that it was very poorly managed, very poorly run without sufficient capacity for the grain. And then in order to popularize it, the fellow behind it was buying high, selling low. Suddenly he's offering a few cents more for wheat than anybody else. And then when it's flour, he's selling it for a few cents less or a few dollars less. And he loses something like, was it $100,000 the first year? It's like, the first effort at the mill just was poorly managed.
Next, the IVA took aim at the third plank of the industrial program.
The Home Building Association is a really interesting piece of the Nonpartisan League platform that's enacted in 1919.
The Home Builders Association was actually a tool by which to try to attract the urban vote. The principle was to make low-rate loans available to people with lesser incomes so that they might build a home. This is the start of North Dakota's issues after the war. We're starting to slide into a very perilous economic state. Whether folks have decided they don't need or want a new house, I don't know, but it just never really flies.
What we in fact know is that the effort to build homes through various forms of state subsidy was doomed from the start. Essentially, the state entity itself doesn't have enough capital to extend the types of real estate supports, mostly mortgages, to potential home builders and home buyers to have a kind of wide-ranging appeal. Second, this wasn't part of the Nonpartisan League's original platform or program. In that sense, it was experimental, and it may have been an experiment worth trying, but as an experiment can often work out, it failed. And it fails in a spectacular fashion because those few houses that the Home Building Association is able to fund or subsidize and then complete, a number of them are built in Fargo, and they are actually built for prominent members or prominent allies of the Nonpartisan League.
William Lemke, who decided that a new house in Fargo might be kind of nice. And as I recall, it also had a garage, which was above and beyond for a population that didn't necessarily have cars. And here's a guy that has gone above and beyond for what was supposed to be kind of a poor man's project.
Once that word gets out, once again, it becomes a pretty easy way to point out the ways in which the Nonpartisan League is, first of all, falling short in his promises. Second of all, maybe deviating from the very platform that electors put them into power to enact. And then finally, is just involved in some shady stuff. And it's a public narrative that gets that the Nonpartisan League loses control of, and it's used as a cudgel against the Nonpartisan League for many years to come.
Rocked by scandal, failure, and dwindling trust in its leaders, the League approached the 1920 election with its enemies at last aligned in a united front led by Townley's most vehement critic, William Langer.
The Independent Voters Association will actually urge him to run for governor. He's going to come out of his position as Attorney General and run against the incumbent Lynn Frazier. He does so on the hopes that he will be elected, but probably knowing that it's unrealistic. He's still too young, for starters. His reputation as fighting for truth, justice, and the American way is still intact, though.
He will try to be the governor to stop what he sees as making the NPL program hostage to the ambitions of Townley.
He's got this scathing speech that's directed at the NPL, but you can almost see Townley in it. You have not labored for our state. You have not homesteaded our state. You have brought evil men by the score to our state. You have done nothing to build up our state. And there must be like 15 of these, you are bad, you are bad, you are bad. And apparently a lot of folks are listening.
With the endorsement of the IVA, which includes people who agreed with him on this, he runs against the leadership, but never against the program.
Langer and other IVA candidates lay the blame for the League's failures firmly at Townley's feet.
He had managed over his career as director of the NPL to peeve more people than most people can in a lifetime. Bacon and company are out there pounding the pavement, giving you all kinds of salacious reading material, that Townley is a ne'er-do-well. He'd been a failed farmer, a failed fill-in-the-blank of everything. He was anti-war, and if your son had died, your brother, your nephew, he's basically said that your son was an idiot for either signing up or allowing himself to be drafted. That doesn't help him a lot with folks who have lost a son. Also, there's the whole issue of socialism. Even though it's misunderstood socialism, Bacon, Nelson, Langer can use that and say, he wants to turn us into the Reds. And you see all these delightfully hideous cartoons, particularly from the Red Flame, where you've got the socialists and the Reds and the Bolsheviks that are going to destroy home, family, church, school, government. They're going to make all women available to the sexual demands of any man. Free love. Apparently, enough people buy the story that no one's elected Townley and that Townley is pulling the strings. Well, the state's going to be overrun by socialists, Bolsheviks, Reds, members of the industrial workers of the world. It's another part of the perfect storm. In some way, I think he had just run his course, that some of the folks who were now gaining political experience, Frazier, Langer, Lemke, Kaczynski, Hall, that they now didn't think maybe they needed that guy quite as much. And because he's still rabble-rousing about the war, he's become a bit of a crank.
The League is moving towards a breaking point. Townley is slow to recognize that, but when he does recognize it, he decides to get in front of it at a convention of the National Nonpartisan League by essentially saying, I'm going to show you that nothing wrong is going on here. I'm going to open up the books for anyone to examine so that you know I'm not using the money in shady ways. And I'm going to challenge people to suggest that I am not the person to be leading this organization. In some ways, he engages in this very kind of public cowing of any opposition that might emerge at that convention. And of course, the convention itself is relatively choreographed. He knows exactly who's in the room and who might challenge him and who might not. And he is able to manipulate the situation in order to ensure that he is both publicly validated as being just fine as a leader, that the membership, or at least the representatives of the membership, approve his leadership and his leadership style. as well as having this to point to outside critics who are saying, oh, Townley is too authoritarian, he has too much control, there's no democracy in the organization itself. He can then turn to these critics and say, look, I had this very open moment when people were able to offer up critique and perhaps even suggest that I not be the leader of this organization. And not only did the books check out as absolutely fine, but look, I was validated. I'm the leader of this organization. People are not unhappy. Let's move forward to the 1920 election.
As polls opened, leaders of both the IVA and the NPL held their breaths. Once the votes were counted, the League had held voters' support. Lynn Fraser narrowly defeated turncoat William Langer to be re-elected as governor. League counsel Bill Lemke was elected to replace Langer as Attorney General. Most other Leaguers hung on to their offices, although many by only the narrowest of margins. In other states, results were even worse.
They struggle in Minnesota. They're unable to gain a majority in the State House or take a statewide office. They're defeated in Colorado, despite taking over the Democratic Party. They're largely defeated in Montana, despite taking over the Democratic Party there. In Idaho, it's a slightly different story. The Nonpartisan League in Idaho takes off. It becomes a really powerful player in state politics. So much so that in 1918, Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature in Idaho come together and essentially eliminate the direct primary. Eliminating the direct primary meant that everything had to flow through the two major parties. And with that, the Nonpartisan League in Idaho, led by Ray McCaig, is left adrift.
In 1921, although the League hung on to its power in North Dakota, it was about to be rocked to the core.
They wanted something to ensure their position economically as farmers, to bring about justice for them and against things like, the practices of the terminal elevators in Minnesota, the railroad companies, these industries that had a direct impact on their bottom line as farmers. You just have the situation where your leadership of your organization is trying to enact a very sweeping program of change in the state. I think that was a little too much for the voters of North Dakota.
North Dakota is falling into a pretty deep agricultural depression. We think of the depression as being the 1930s. North Dakota farmers are in depression 1920, 1921. It's another part of the perfect storm. The war is over, your son's dead, the economy isn't bouncing back, Townley's a bit of a scoundrel, and hey, we've got this brand new law. We can get rid of these guys.
Less than a year after the League persuaded voters to enact a law allowing them to remove an elected official, the voters turned that law on the League itself. A recall petition was filed to remove League Governor Fraser, Attorney General Bill Lemke, and Secretary of Agriculture and Labor John Hagan from office and replace them with IVA-endorsed Republican candidates. Further, the IVA had enough signatures to put 5 initiated measures on the ballot to close down the state-owned industries the League had worked so hard to create.
The political controversy that was stirred up by creating institutions made Fraser vulnerable to the criticisms that his political program was socialist. He was accused of being a communist. He was accused of supporting free love. The standard political mud that is tossed, all of that mud started to be thrown as they are succeeding in their quest and struggle to create these institutions.
Well, I think the big issue was one of their own doing. They themselves had sponsored, supported, or in Fraser's case, signed paperwork that brought us the whole process to recall officials. Any state official, senators, representatives, sheriffs can be recalled from office. And so they've actually set that in motion that even if you'd never thought of it before, now you have this. So you've made it easier. You've made it feasible. And Fraser and the gang get the boot.
In an historic special election on October 28, 1921, Fraser, Lemke, and Hagan became the first elected officials in United States history to be recalled by the voters. But surprisingly, the voters upheld all 5 measures of the industrial program.
We're willing to toss the rascals out and replace them, but we're also very willing to keep the experiment going. We haven't given up on the experiment after 4 years, 5 years, even though the bank was problematic, the mill and elevator were problematic, home builders was problematic. The whole idea of the Industrial Commission isn't maybe absolutely problematic, but it's questionable. The only thing that's working is hail insurance. But we still had that hope. We still had that dream that this was going to succeed. And I just love the bifurcation that had to be going on in people's minds. This is good. They have produced good, but they have run their course. And now throw the rascals out.
In a surprising turn of events, the Bank of North Dakota and the State Mill and Elevator were now in the hands of the League's opponents.
The amazing thing is that the IVA didn't shut down the bank. And it shouldn't be amazing because, hey, I have a bank at my disposal. I'm going to shut this down? I don't think so. They might be opposed to it politically. Philosophically, they might be opposed to it. But pragmatically, it's a great institution for the state. And it was really helpful. And they could see the use of it. And so in some ways, the Bank of North Dakota is an example of pragmatic politics over political philosophy, where pragmatism won.
But even with the defeat of the League in the recall election, it did not spell the end of the NPL dream. It did not even mean the end of the career of the first governor to be recalled from office, Lynn Fraser.
It's interesting that he took the recall very well. He actually commented that the farm had fallen into disrepair while he had been governor, and that he needed to go back and do some work on the farm and get the farm back into good operation. So the recall gave him an opportunity to save his own business. It is, I think, one of the more amazing political stories in American political history. He is recalled and then is elected to the United States Senate in 1922. Obviously, the voters were not that afraid of what Fraser represented. Now, the cynics in North Dakota would say, well, that's just their way of getting rid of their problem. Ship them to Washington, D.C., and then you can elect safe politicians here in the state. But the other side of that is this idea of continuing the revolution, continuing the Nonpartisan League, moving the Nonpartisan League to a national level. And apparently the voters at that time understood that they were not going to be successful at the state level with their political program, but their political values and the concerns and goals were still important enough to try to move it to the federal level.
It wasn't only the League's elected officials who lost their power in the 1921 election.
There's a lot of soul searching. And some of that soul searching gets redirected at Townley. Townley's also facing a variety of outside pressures. In particular, a series of lawsuits brought against him, especially in the state of Minnesota, by small-town attorneys or citizens around the question of loyalty during the World War I years. And those are cases that are caught up in the court system and aren't being really rectified or determined until 1921. And in fact, Townley will spend time in jail in 1921 in Jackson County, Minnesota. He comes out of jail. He's been discredited publicly. There's all kinds of internal dissent in the League. And the people working at the state level in North Dakota, as well as Minnesota and Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado and Montana and Idaho, and even Washington State, they're able to say, well, maybe this is not the way forward. He eventually resigns. When he resigns as someone who's already lost power over the organization.
Although some hoped Townley's resignation would help save the League, it was too late.
People aren't signing up anymore to the membership. The name still exists, but they're not putting out the leader. They can't pay their phone bill. They can't pay their office rent. And before long, about 1922, the organization is defunct.
Once they accomplish those initial set of goals, it's pretty much downhill. The business of creating a unified front for farmers, having a state mill and elevator, State Bank of North Dakota, getting some justice for farmers, for equity in lending and finance, and having a place for them to put their grain. Once those items are fulfilled, then the rest of the program essentially collapses.
Even national observers had really thought that this was the moment when the League was going to go over the top and really become an organization that didn't only just have a presence and express power in states outside of North Dakota, but actually held power in states outside of North Dakota. It's easy as we look back on the Nonpartisan League, especially in the North Dakota experience, and to say, look, these were farmers who in the 19-teens and early 1920s were for state-owned enterprises like the bank and the flour mill and the state elevator. And in our way of thinking in the 2000s, that must mean that they were socialists, because any state involvement in the economy automatically must be that. When in fact, it is important to recognize that farmer members of the Nonpartisan League, not necessarily some of the inner circle of leaders who remained committed socialists, but farmer members of the Nonpartisan League didn't want to be anything other than people who participated in the marketplace. These people are committed capitalists.
And that capitalist character had refused to dismantle the industrial program. But now the League's industrial program was in the hands of the League's enemies.
The bonds were sold the day before the opposition took control. And so finally, the opposition, the IVA, which was opposed to state ownership, which was opposed to the Bank of North Dakota, all of a sudden had $12.3 million to lend to farmers, create the mill and elevator. And their issue was, oh my God, we've got this money, we're supposed to be lending it, we don't believe in lending it. That's really the irony. They didn't want the NPL to have it. They didn't want the NPL to be in control of it. But all of a sudden, I can be in control of it. And we're going to start all over again.
The newly elected Industrial Commission overhauled the League's programs. The scandal-ridden Home Building Association was closed down, as was the financially disastrous experimental state mill in Drake. Now it was time for the IVA to rebuild the state industries in its own image.
The minute the replacements got in, they also saw the benefit of the state mill and the Bank of North Dakota and strengthened them and kept them going. And so now the state mill and the bank are beyond politics.
I would say the bank only became successful once the opponents of the bank took control of it. The Nonpartisan League made around 1,200 loans to farmers, but it had thousands of appraisals on its desk waiting to fund once the bonds were sold. The bonds were sold. The next day, October 28th, the opposition took power, said we're going to take 6 months, we're cleaning house. They fired 30 or 36 bank employees, created a whole other institution within the farm loan department. And by the time the bank finished in its farm lending business in 1940, they had made 16,000 loans. That's pretty phenomenal for a state this size.
The IVA faced a more difficult challenge with the state mill.
Interesting history on why it wound up in Grand Forks, because historically the legislators from the Grand Forks area were opposed to the mill and to the Bank of North Dakota. They opposed a lot of the Nonpartisan League initiatives. But some businesses in Grand Forks got together and promised to buy up to $1 million worth of the bonds and to give some free land for the location of the mill. And that was a significant and sufficient enticement to establish Grand Forks as a place where it would be.
Prominent among those Grand Forks businessmen was Jerry Bacon.
Here's a man who thinks he knows what's best. And what's best is getting rid of Townley and those other socialists, those other creepy little people that you don't like. But he also can see what's good for the state. Yes, didn't like that riffraff that was running it, but now we will have the chance to have good people run the place. And all the better if it can be in the backyard.
With the IVA now firmly in control of a profitable state bank and the state mill and elevator farmers had fought for decades beginning construction, it looked as if the League was about to become a small footnote in history.
The Nonpartisan League grew like a political prairie fire. When you go all the way to the top and everything you have ran on gets done, where do you go from there? I mean, the meteoric rise of the NPL, where do you go from the top?
That 1920s period was a real challenge. The enemies of the NPL, and there were numerous, because the scandal over the Scandinavian American Bank resulted in a wet blanket being thrown over the League's political program. And that wet blanket, I suspect, was there probably until the 1960s.
It almost became a dirty word to have been an NPL member maybe in the early 20s to maybe the early 30s when Langer comes in and gives birth to a NPL Part 2.
Production funding for The Rise and Fall of the Nonpartisan League is provided in part by the North Dakota Humanities Council, a nonprofit independent state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.
To purchase a DVD copy of the complete 3-hour series of The Rise and Fall of the Nonpartisan League, including bonus features, call 1-800-359-6900 or order online at www.prairiepublic.org.